Welcome to this event, which is the final event in a conference that was organized by our university. The title of the conference was the first international conference on the Muslim Ummah, analyzing a new paradigm, synthesizing a new paradigm, analyzing modern challenges. So I thank you all for being with us tonight. Thank you. For an important discussion that we are going to have this evening with two of the most sought after, renowned and intellectual academics and professors in the world. Professor Tariq Ramadan, Oxford University professor, well-known author throughout the world, not just the Muslim world, who has talked about Islamic reform, Islamic ethics, and lectured frequently about how Islam could adapt, or how the Muslims could adapt to the modern world, and the relationship between Islam and the West, and the role that we should play in progress of humanity. We're also blessed to have with us Professor John Esposito from the United States, Georgetown professor, who's been writing about Islam and Muslims and the conditions of the Muslim Ummah for over 45 years. Dozens of books, well known, and he's been at the forefront of this particular time where Islam is under attack, especially in the age of Islamophobia that we live in today. Sabah ad-Din Zaim University, also president, is with us, and he will welcome all of you today. And it talks volume about the commitment of this university to academic advancement and research by establishing such a center that will try to look at these issues and try to propose solutions to the problems that the Ummah and the Islamic world face today. So I would like to say a word about our third speaker, Professor and Dr. Ibrahim Kalin, who was supposed to be with us tonight. However, he has been called to duty to travel with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to Serbia, so he regrets not to be here tonight. And he asked me personally to apologize for you, because he told me the affairs of the state comes first, and I totally agree with that. So regretfully, he would not be with us tonight. But we are very fortunate to have among us the other two speakers, and we are very pleased to have them with us. So I would like to call to the stage first Dr. Mehmet Bulut, the president of Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. Next, I would like to call Professor Tariq Ramadan from Oxford University. And Dr. John Esposito from Georgetown University. First, I would call to the podium Dr. Professor Mehmet Bulut.
Esselamu Aleyküm. Hepinize hayırlı akşamlar diliyorum. Öncelikle bu organizasyonu gerçekleştiren Profesör Sami Al-Arian hocamıza üniversitem adına teşekkür ediyorum. Bize bu salonu tahsis eden belediyemize, destek veren bütün kurumlara da ayrı ayrı teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi müsaade ederseniz bu noktadan sonra İngilizce konuşmama devam etmek istiyorum. Çünkü var bilebildiğim kadar çeviri. Dear guests, Professor Tariq Ramazan from Oxford University, Professor John Esposito from Georgetown, and Professor Sami Al-Arian from Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and all the other professors and researchers from different parts of the world. I would like to thank you to all of you for coming tonight and for making contributions to this important organization of the Islamic Ummah for 3 days during the different sessions. And I would like to thank to all organizers and contributors, supporters, and partners of this event. I am very happy to be here today to share with more audience than the university. In 2 days we discussed, and tonight we will make some more discussions, and we will present our views, and we will get some new visions from our very strong supporters and strong, researchers, specialists on the issue for the future of Islamic world in politics, in social science, in economics, and in other parts of the research areas. And as you know, we are in a turning point nowadays after a long history in the Middle East and the Islamic world. The Islamic countries nowadays have some very serious crisis inside, and they try to, from Arab Spring, they try to reach to a new stage in recent decades, but unfortunately, in recent years, they could not manage because of their own situations, because of their own inside problems, and in addition to their own problems, some hegemonic powers in the region are also affected the process, as we have seen step by step, day by day, what's happening in the region. And nowadays, I am seeing that the big powers are now competing in the center of Islamic world for their future aims. But we, as scholars and as thinkers, in these days, we try to understand first what's happening and what we can do for the future of Islamic world and the rest of the world. In this 2 days conference, in this final session, I believe we come to some conclusions, and we realize that there are some solutions we can do as scholars, as institutions, and of course there are some other parts, there are some other persons may be more responsible than us, and they could do, we discussed in these days. But we as scholars, we think that we will, if we can make good collaboration and cooperation by individuals and by institutions, not just, from universities, from business sector, from, from social actors, from economic actors, and also with political sides. If we can come together and to try to find solutions for the future of Islamic Ummah, we can do something, and we can, reach to a better situation in the heart of Islamic world and in the region. So again, at this point, I would like to thank to all the contributors for making their contributions to this organization. And we as Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University and with Center of Islam and Global Affairs and with other research institutes, we will continue to make contribution for the solving of problems in Islamic world and in the rest of the world. Thank you again for coming and for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bulut. The theme of tonight's discussion is the meaning of the Muslim Ummah in the modern world. The word Ummah, meaning the global Muslim community, is a word that was mentioned in the Quran, where it says, إِنَّ هَذِهِ أُمَّتْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاعْبُدُونَ وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاتَّقُونَ. This ummah, this community is one. I am your Lord, so worship me, so be righteous. In the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says about this condition of the ummah, this ummah, that when part of that ummah aches, the whole body, meaning the whole ummah, aches. This concept historically existed in the minds and hearts of Muslims throughout the centuries. It was symbolized throughout by this concept of one ummah, one leader. In his book At-Tawheed, the late Professor Ismail Farouqi talked about the principles of politics, economics, social conditions, and in each one of them he brought this concept, at least at the conceptual level, of ummatism, that all these principles came about with this concept. On the other hand, we find in a new released book by Jamil Aydin called The Idea of the Muslim World, that was published this year. He questions whether that concept actually existed in reality. He says there may have been sympathies. People would sympathize with conditions of those who may share their beliefs and values. But he questions whether that concept existed in reality. He says that this concept actually is only 150 years or so, and it was brought about by colonialism and Islamism. In other words, the two poles, what you call Islamophobes and those who believed in Islam as a political action program. But when we look back in history, we find even though the Ummah declined in one area, it was rising in another. While it was declining in Andalusia, Muslim Spain, it was rising in Istanbul, Anatolia. So there always existed perhaps different periods where Muslims or the body of Muslims or the community of believers would decline in one area and rise in another. But what we are witnessing since the fall of the Ottoman Empire almost a century ago is a different kind of conditions, with the emergence of a nation state, with the emergence of and the widening of the gap between the Muslim world and global powers. Things have changed. We may see sympathies like what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s, or Bosnia in the 90s, or Kosovo early this century, or Burma just this year. Does that constitute an ummah? Or the open wound that we've been living through as an ummah in Palestine, with the loss of Palestine and with what's happening there, is a grave example of the conditions of this ummah. Some people are questioning whether the ummah is alive. So Professor Tariq Ramadan will address this topic, which is the meaning of the Muslim ummah in the modern world. Do we really have an ummah when we have no one who can actually practice real sovereignty and independence, with the exceptions possibly of two countries, Turkey and Iran? Does any other country really we can call independent? The other speaker will address a topic that is very much related to the conditions of the ummah and the meaning of the ummah. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, with the collapse of communism, this new thesis, new paradigm that came about, which was espoused and promoted by even people who came from academia like Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington, this notion of clash of civilization, that somehow Islamic civilization is not compatible with Western civilization, that somehow there has to be a conflict between values that people in the Muslim world hold dear and liberal values that came and thrived in the West. And throughout these 30 years or so, we've witnessed the rise of Islamophobia, the fear and hatred of Muslims, especially after the tragic events of 9/11 in the United States. We've seen wars and terrorism throughout, claiming hundreds of thousands, even millions of lives. And with the advent of the Arab Spring, this glimmer of hope that came for a very short moment, people had hope that somehow we're going to get out of this spiral of wars and violence and destruction and death, only to be crushed. So part of our discussion tonight would be what kind of relationship, what kind of system we want to see in our world, and what kind of relationship we would like to see between the Muslim world and global powers. These two topics will be addressed tonight, will be followed by a discussion on the stage, and then we'll take your questions for our speakers to answer them. Professor Tariq Ramadan.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami, for organizing this conference, this workshop and now this lecture, talking about an important topic. And as the time is counted, we have to go straight to the point. What I want to do really is to, in a way, problematize the notion of Ummah in order for the Muslims to get a deep understanding of what it means and in which way we have to deal with it, to be a contribution not only within the Muslim majority countries, but from within the Muslim majority countries to the second discussion that we will have with Professor Esposito when it comes to our relationship to the West. But I think that in our understanding of some of the Islamic notions, we are restrictive and sometimes not getting it. And as it was said at the beginning, the notion of Ummah, it's a complex notion. It's not an easy one, and it's a contested notion even among some scholars or some trends within the Muslim communities around the world. And we, sorry, may have to take some, oops, Bismillah. So what I was saying is that it's polysemous, many meanings that you can get, and you have the intimate, when you have, for example, in the Quran, something which has to do with, as it was said, your ummah is one ummah, but at the same time, inna Ibrahim kana ummatan qanitan lillah. Ibrahim as an individual was an ummah, and then you come to the Quran and وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا طَائِرٍ يُطِيرُ بِجَنَاحَيْهِ إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ, meaning that everywhere around the world you have ummah, the community. And that's very important to understand that we are one community, and we have to understand the meaning of this community among communities, within the world. So there is no way for us to speak about community and ummah if we don't have a deep understanding of the world view from an Islamic perspective. We should not disconnect our political involvement with power when we don't get a worldview dealing with what? Ummah means people, and people before power. People is power. This is what we have to get. It's the way we have to understand our religion, that it comes from people. It doesn't come from first. It's not the power defining the people, it's the people who have to look for their power in a way which is exactly what Islam is all about. Amruhum shura bainahum means the Muslims come together as an ummah and decide for themselves. So no way to be an ummah if there is no independence. No way there is an ummah if there is no power out of this independence. So that's the understanding within the concerts of all the ummah that we have around us, which is important. Having said that, and say that we have to put the right thing on the right order, it's people first, the ummah first, and then you have a message, la ilaha illallah, a message, and then you go with your ummah, understanding what is the meaning of your ummah among all the ummah around you. So what I would like to say quite quickly is just we need to have a comprehensive approach, and this comprehensive approach is to deal with something which is important, because when we have in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, O you people, there is the first big ummah, it's the humanity. And we have to be very careful not in the name of my belonging to a specific ummah to forget my belonging to humanity, because Allah is talking to us saying, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. So every single human being is dignified. So never your ummah could be against the dignity of human beings. You are here to serve him, meaning all humanity, with the same understanding that we are equal in dignity, equal in freedom, and equal seeking knowledge and seeking this community and structured community based on these principles. Having said that, with this comprehensive approach, we have also to deal at the more local level. That's something which is very important, that you have this overall understanding of what an ummah is among the ummah, and then at the same time in which way you have to be involved at your level, because you have to be realistic. You have to be realistic. You're belonging to somewhere. You belong to somewhere. And when you come, for example, sometimes, I'm coming from Egypt. I'm trying to be fair to some of the principles. And sometimes you speak about Palestine, or you speak about Turkey, you speak about Moroccan people, and sometimes the first reaction of the people that you are constructively criticizing, they feel that you are against them. So there is a connection to some realities around you that you have to take into account. You can't undermine the notion of belonging to a country, belonging to a history. This is part of us. So we can't, with the first comprehensive understanding of Ummah, just undermine and underestimate the fact that we are part of a society, of a nation, and we have to deal with this. That's essential in our understanding. We have to be realistic, but we have to be careful that our emotional belonging to our nation, to our society, is not going to be against our principles and our belonging to humanity, meaning that nationalism is not the way forward. Patriotism, that you feel that you belong to a country, that's fine. But at the end, thinking that my country, right or wrong, and Islamic, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, wherever, my country, right or wrong, I go for it? No. My country, right. Right, my country, wrong, stand up. Say what you have to say, because Islam is... No. I have a special fatwa with clapping. When you like what you hear, it's like when you read something, a nice book, when you have a good idea, you don't clap, you think about it. So listen as if you were reading. So the point here, it's essential for us to have this understanding, because the question here is not only to think about the crisis within the Muslim Ummah, is in which way we are going to be a contribution, not only for ourselves, from the world, because the world is in crisis, because we are facing very dangerous realities today when it comes to this discussion. So what I wanted to say is to go from the global to the local and come back to the global. Very quickly, what I wanted to say, in our understanding that La ilaha illallah, there is only one God, and Tawheed is central, and once again what you said about Al-Faruqi is that he was coming back to this, saying this is central. Our understanding is that there is one God, only one God, and our humanity, we are all coming from Adam and we are all equal. Understanding is this, that we also say Rabbul Alameen, the Lord of the worlds, and in these worlds there are Ummah, there are communities, and we are one of them. We got the last revelation coming back to the first principles. And the first principle is that our worldview is based on celebrating this humanity by respecting from the very beginning diversity, pluralism, and, as I said, the equal rights for everybody. Freedom, justice, and dignity are the principles on which our worldview is based. And our role will always to come from our Islamic principles to come back to the foundational principles of our humanity, not against the people, but serving the people and reminding them. And there is something which is important here, that we have in the Quran, فَضَّلَكُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, saying this to Bani Israel, that you have been chosen. So there is something which is a chosen ummah. A chosen ummah means what? That you are privileged because of your blood, privileged because of your belonging? Never. You are privileged in the way, فَضَّلَكُمْ, you have to serve humanity. So your ummah, the last ummah, is فَضَّلَكُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, in order for you to serve humanity based on your principles. So this election is about serving. It's not about being served. It's not about a specific destiny. It's not, I'm in the right side of history because I am a Muslim. Alhamdulillah. Whatever happened, I am a Muslim. That's wrong. You can be a Muslim and on the wrong side of history, as you know, many are. So, having said that, and when we come to the discussion here quite quickly, is to understand this, to understand this deep meaning of our ummah. And why am I saying this? It's not just words, this is not theory. It's a sense of responsibility. It's to come back to this confidence. You are not going to get independence. You're not going to get an understanding of ummah if you don't start with this responsibility before God and humanity that you have to serve, and you have to understand on what is based your belonging to this community. It's based on principles, not blood, not country, not nationality, not culture. Principles. I belong to my principles before God. That's the starting point of everything, to the point that even in my country I have to be self-critical. I have to say to my country, to my government, what you are doing, not in my name. That's the very essence of what it means to be somebody understanding the responsibility of belonging to this ummah. Al-Ummah al-Islamiyya, based on principles. Now, when I am saying this, I come to the first is that, yes, there is something that Dr. Sami was referring to, that I belong to a religious community. And the religious community is two things. Two things is the spiritual communion that we have. Yes, when it comes to the pilgrimage, people coming from everywhere, rich, poor, black, white, whatever, we come together and there is this spiritual communion. And at the same time, the spiritual communion is based on we belong to the same principles. We come with the same principles, with the same understanding that there is one God asking us to be dignified, to be just, to serve the people, and to behave the right way. So this is where we come. Having said this, what the Prophet is telling us within this community, when it's between two individuals and between countries, help your brother when he's right or wrong. How am I going to help my brother when he's wrong, or my sister when she's wrong? By stopping him from doing it. So our community is based on principles and self-criticism. It's this awareness that we have to be now self-critical. And by the way, if the state of affairs now with Muslims is not the way it should be, it's not because of the West only. It's not because of the other only. Palestine is not dying only because of the West, but because of the Arabs, because of the Muslims, because of that we are not doing our job. So we have to be self-critical and to understand, instead of lecturing the world, let us be self-critical with us as an ummah understanding what are the principles on which we rely and in which way we have to be with ourselves and with the others. Last point. All what I said is also helping us to avoid something that I said at the beginning about nationalism. Yes, be part of your country. Try to do, and this is something which is important. If you look even at the structure of the Islamic principles, the 5 pillars of Islam, the first one is vertical. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. The second one is connected to God. The third one is connected to God, the zakat, and to human beings. And the secret of zakat, you have to pay it here, where you live. So the sense of the ummah is a perception of something which is comprehensive and very local. تُؤْخَذْ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ لِفُقَرَائِهِمْ. Here you have to pay. So you have to know your country. You have to be involved. So our sense of belonging is very important, but there is something that we have to avoid. No nationalism in Islam. No narrow understanding that I belong. And once again, the best thing that you can do for your country, the best thing that we can do for the Muslim ummah is to be critical when we have to be critical, when things are not done right. When people are in jail and they should not be in jail, we have to say it. When people are tortured and they should not be tortured, we have to say it. This is the way we need to be free, but free not to talk against them, free to talk against ourselves, our governments, and them. Freedom it's in all directions. And we have to have the courage. There will be no revival of the ummah if we don't find courageous Muslims. Courageous Muslims is the right way to understand. I belong to a community that is responsible to serve humanity. And the last point that I wanted to make connected to this is that we come to our country, we say this, but we have to show concerns, and this is why we want. You know, I made a mistake for 20 years. I made a mistake responding to the West by saying, you know what, we are European citizens and we want to show you that we are going to be American citizens. All this is fine. But now I see American Muslim citizens, European Muslim citizens, they are so obsessed with being accepted as citizens that they are even forgetting that they are human beings. So they keep quiet about migrants, they keep quiet about prisoners, they keep quiet about Palestine, they keep quiet about the Rohingyas, just to be citizens. You don't get my point. My point is, no way that you are going to be a good citizen in a country if you don't come back to, I belong to an ummah based on principles, and wherever I am, against any government, be it a Muslim government or an American government, I have to speak the truth. My belonging to the ummah is bring us back to the main principles as the foundation of our common humanity. Inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Dr. Ramadan. Next, we have Dr. Esposito, who's going to address us on towards a new relationship between the Muslim world and the West.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. To answer a question I've been asked 4 times today by your media, yes, I have been in Istanbul before. My wife and I came here in 1971, and we've come back regularly. Now we can get that out of the way. But I was happy to hear Sami refer to Ismail al-Faruqi. I think it was at the beginning of the panel, the president asked me, leaned over and said, did you ever know Ismail al-Faruqi? And I said, I was his first PhD. So yes. And it's probably one of the reasons why in the early 70s we spent a lot of time traveling around the Muslim world. I'm going to speak about a topic which in the 70s and 80s I wouldn't have thought I'd have to speak about. It's a very difficult topic, because let me begin by saying we're in very difficult and dangerous times. We're in very difficult and dangerous times. And it is it is literally everybody. It is everybody in the Muslim world, it is everybody in the West, and it's everybody in the globe. All you have to do is pick up your newspaper or look at a television, and you have a sense of a world that is imploding and exploding. A world that is raising questions about whether or not nation states will ever survive. What will happen to them? A world where, unlike years before, so many believers, for example, Muslims, so many Muslims do not live in Muslim countries, but live as minorities all over the world. Many of them prospering, and others, like the Rohingya, suffering. So these are very difficult times, and I'm going to touch on some very difficult points. You will find that I will be critical both of Muslims, the Muslim world, and Western countries. In a report, a major report in 2015, the report noted that for 9 consecutive years, a condition of global political rights and civil liberties has declined precipitously. What did that really mean? The acceptance of democracy as the world's dominant form of government and of an international system built on democratic ideals is under a great threat, a greater threat than at any point in the last year. Let's just take a look at that. Major polls by Pew, I was associated with Gallup, but also by Pew, starting in the mid-2000s, showed that Muslims across the world, majorities of Muslims, wanted good governance, wanted greater democratization, human rights, freedom, free press. And then let's take a look at the realities in the Muslim world. In how many countries do we find it? And in how many countries in recent years do we see it receding? On the other hand, let's take a look at the West, Europe and America. I grew up in America, which was and is an immigrant country. So we are, unlike a lot of other countries, we are a country of immigrants from our beginning and throughout our whole history. And yet, what do we see today in America? We see the rise of anti-immigrant groups, whether they're Mexican, whether they're Latin American, or whether they're Muslims. We see a president that says Islam hates us. A president that says we should think about a database on Muslims, perhaps, or monitoring mosques, and who in fact is wanting to implement a Muslim ban. We look at Europe and we look at European elections, and what do we see? Parties that did not exist 10, 20 years ago, new anti-immigrant parties, but that's not the most important thing. The important thing is because there are new anti-immigrant parties, and they're become stronger, mainstream parties in the UK and in France, at times, in order to not be distanced from those votes, wind up slipping away from their democratic ideals. A fundamental question exists today in this precipitous situation after the Arab Spring. Oh my God, think of what the Arab Spring was like. On the one hand, there was a major article in the New York Times where a social scientist said that looking at social scientists and their absolute failure to see or predict democracy really demonstrated that if you were talking about the ability of social scientists, a chimpanzee, a monkey, could have done better. Governments did not expect it. Experts did not expect it. Sure, people thought greater democratization would come in some of the authoritarian states down the line, but not anytime soon. Consider the fact that Egypt, Libya, Tunisia had presidents that were in 30, 35 plus years, that royal families have been major players and grand authorities in the Gulf, in the Middle East, and that some were becoming even more authoritarian. So what is the situation, though, with the Arab Spring? The first thing that happened after the Arab Spring was that I came to Istanbul, and with SETA, and a center that I founded, the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, we had a major conference on the Arab Spring. We invited people from Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria. There were people from the EU, from the United States, and it was a closed meeting. However different people were, they had two basic questions. That is, the Muslim representatives, the young people and the older people, who were hoping that they, in presidential elections, would see themselves or their parties coming to power, and this replacement of authoritarian regimes. The two questions were, number one, they said, we have a deep state that still exists, and we're worried about what that will mean. We know that in America and France, for example, or even Russia, this was what was being said, that when the winners won, the deep state disappeared because the losers were either killed, put in prison, or driven out of the country. But their concern was, what role would the deep state play? And of course, we see what happened in Egypt. There never was a Morsi government. There was a Morsi presidency. You couldn't say it's a government because Morsi, or whomever had been elected, had no control over the judiciary and the people that were there, the military, the security forces. And you could see that when the coup came. So their first concern was major, and they were right. Their second concern was about the West. And they brought it up more than once. They brought it up at the beginning and the end, because it's a difficult question, and they really couldn't believe that there would be a positive answer. The basic question was, will the West allow us to elect our own government? Will it allow us to embrace democracy, but in doing that, to pick the people that we would like to see elected? Now, why did they say that? A, they knew that with the invasion of Iraq, America already and the UK already knew the kind of government it wanted to set up, so it wasn't just an invasion, it became an occupation. And they knew who they wanted to put into the presidency, Ahmad Chalabi. But they also did it and reflected what the Gallup polls were showing from 2001 to 2007, and even just before the Arab Spring, and that is majorities of Muslims. We did a survey and wrote a book called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, having looked at 35 Muslim countries from all over the world. Majorities of Muslims wanted democracy, admired Western education and technology, but majorities of Muslims also thought that A, the West tended to be biased when it came to Islam and Muslims, and that indeed Arab and Muslim life was somehow cheaper than the lives of other people. Why is it that American government could keep track, and it should have kept track, and I'm glad it did, of all the Americans that died or were wounded? But why is it that they never had statistics on all the people in Iraq or in Afghanistan that died or were wounded? And what we know from the Gallup poll was that the concern, therefore, was of people who wanted democracy, but the other concern that they expressed was that they didn't believe that the West would ever really support democracy, and particularly the idea that people could pick a group or an individual that would not necessarily be as tight with America and Europe as, let's say, the authoritarian regimes were. At the end of the day, that proved correct. Because what we saw with the Arab Spring was that the US and the EU basically were hesitating. They weren't really ready. A, they didn't expect it, but then they had to deal with a reality where for all those years, governments in the region would say, look, you need to support us, you can count on us. In effect, whether we're authoritarian or not. If not us, then they're going to come in. And they, meaning the Islamists, they're going to come in, and you won't have that same kind of connection. And so you could see that hesitation initially in both the EU and the US. In the US, you would see well-meaning statements that contradicted each other. In the first week or two, you might have the president saying, we respect the right of the people who are out in the square to express their wants with regard to government. And at the same time, you might have the Secretary of State say, President Mubarak is a longtime ally of us. And when the move was actually made to accept the governments that were elected, and that stunned, in fact, Westerners as well as many people in the Muslim world, how could Ennahda win in elections? Ennahda had been underground or in exile for 20 or 25 years. I worked closely in writing about Rashid Ghanouchi, etc., but I did it all in London. The idea that he would come back and when elections occurred, that Ennahda would do so well. How could the Muslim Brotherhood do so well, especially, not that it wasn't a strong movement, but especially since, in general, the Brotherhood had backed off going into the square. Younger brothers did. And there were other parties and other people. The idea that they would also win. And then, of course, the real proof came when, a short time later, you had the coup, and when, for example, the President of the United States refused to call a coup. As one expert said, who wasn't exactly supporting the coup, but was saying with regard to the President, the definition of a coup is X, and therefore a coup is a coup, and this is a military coup. What signal did that send? And look at what happened. Within a short period of time, the Sisi government was normalized. Normalized in terms of relations, in terms of trade, in terms of assistance. At the same time, part of what we have to be concerned about was the rise and growth of ISIS and its threat. Not only its threat in the region, which has been incredible in terms of Syria and Iraq, but also then the attacks in Europe. But the sad thing is that many people think that if you can just kill ISIS, just like they believed if you could just kill bin Laden and weaken AQ, it would all end. The fact is, unless we address the underlying causes for radicalism, unless we address the desires of the mainstream majority for self-determination and good governance, unless those political, economic, and social issues are addressed, we will continue to have instability and, in fact, growing instability. And if ISIS is pushed out, another group will arise. And that's why it becomes very important to look at what the nature of governments in the region have looked like in this post-Arab winter, as it were, and U.S.-European relations. What we know is that for at least a year before the coup in Egypt, the UAE and the Saudi Arabia were supporting those who were planning to overthrow the government, and we know that since that time they have given major support. We know that governments in the Gulf, not all, but a number of governments in the Gulf, have not only been supportive, but have continued to be supportive of the notion of wanting to not distinguish between what people want, whether it's a secular or an Islamist government, but rather to become more entrenched in the power that they have. Entrenched monarchies have, in fact, made themselves more entrenched, both by the kinds of increase in, if you will, aid and assistance and goodies that they gave to their citizens, but also by far more tighter security, far more repression. On the other hand, look at the US and the EU, what has occurred since then. And by the way, when I say this, I am not condemning all of the United States or all of the EU. I'm not announcing that I want to live in Istanbul, or if I had a choice, I'd be in the little village that my family comes from in Italy. You have terrific food, the best food in the Muslim world, but you are vying with Italian food. If my dad were here, he'd be saying, this is great food, it's Italian. And if he didn't like it, he'd say, okay, it's not Italian. The reality of it is, though, that the US and the EU have in fact normalized their relationship, not only with Egypt, but have normalized the conventional wisdom that many thought would pass. Many thought that with the Arab Spring, a kind of old world order would be replaced by a new world order. And that new world order would be one that fully recognized self-determination, good governance, human freedoms. But instead, in many ways, as governments became more entrenched in the region, the US and Britain, for example, drew far closer with these governments. In other words, the notion of combating violent extremism has become the overriding approach, and too often there's a split among policymakers. Those who like the easy answer, which is the answer is religion. The religion's a problem, Islam is the problem. So if we can just deal with Muslim religious leaders, if we can have them have big meetings and they can denounce violence and terrorism, everything, should be better, and figure out ways to implement it. Rather than addressing the political conditions, the grievances that drove people into the squares in Tunisia, in Libya, and those that are fighting and dying in Syria. And not only doing that, but drawing even closer to some of those regimes. Not only politically, in terms of combating violent extremism, but economically or business-wise. So you have stronger relations, stronger business deals in terms of arms sales, in terms of planes, etc. We know, sadly, that President Trump bragged when he went to Saudi Arabia. People were looking and feeling, if he said Islam hates us, and there are a lot of them that hate us, would he be saying these kinds of things, or could he even deal with Saudi Arabia? Instead, he took a different tack. He basically said our relationship is based on combating violent extremism. I mean, the subtext was, what you do in your own country, what people do is their own business, okay? So, combating violent extremism and business. And he then bragged when he came back that he brought back some $500 billion worth of business, a number that I can't even compute. What does that mean in terms of moving forward then, without that new world order? The fallback simply on the idea that supporting a security state brings stability is true short term. It does not bring it long term. And the fact is, the Arab Spring did fail. Short term, there will be no quick democratization in a number of countries. Long term, the genie was let out of the bottle. And in many countries, the population of youth run 40 to 60%, and other disaffected people. So there's no doubt about the fact that in time, this kind of change will occur. But the real question is, how will they move forward? I'm going to run about 5 minutes overtime. He doesn't know, usually when I speak, like tonight, he should have dinner ready for all of you. I was trained by both Gaddafi and the former leader of Cuba in public oracle, which means I talk for 4 to 8 hours if I get going. So let's think about what the major question then is in this new world order. Can or will authoritarian nations open up and seek on their own a transformation over a number of years, a transformation to constitutional monarchy? I don't see anybody leading the way. I see parliaments, yes, but the parliaments only exist with the good graces of the head of the country, or shura councils that don't have much teeth in terms of what they can do. Can or will institutions of power be redefined or replaced by more democratizing of government? Will civil society be allowed to flourish? I remember years ago when people would say, yes, they're authoritarian regimes, but they have strong civil societies. I once went to a World Economic Forum meeting, and the in thing was whether or not you had a strong civil society and whether or not you had NGOs. The problem was the spokesperson for Egypt was bragging with the spokesperson from Jordan in terms of how many NGOs they had and how they had grown. And it would be numbers like, oh, we have 600 NGOs. The only difference is in Egypt, these non-government organizations are, in fact, government-regulated non-government organizations, or they don't exist at all. So can we count on that? I don't think so. Therefore, can the culture and values of authoritarianism, which have existed for decades due to the nature of governments, will that culture have a chance to be transformed into the culture and values of democratization? Without that, you could have the situation you had in Egypt. If you had the culture and values of democratization, people who objected to the government would have been waiting for the next elections to turn them out, rather than actually supporting a coup. That, of course, opens it up to what happened, the restoration of authoritarianism. The pivotal factors, though, in many of these countries is the desire and demands for good governance, the rule of law, autonomy, human rights, dignity. And indeed, the uprisings were called, in many ways, dignity uprisings. In a number of Muslim-majority countries, on the other hand, there are diverse forms of democratic governance. These need to be featured and to be looked at more carefully. But there are key players here, as I see it, or a key player, a significant player, whether one likes it or not, are in fact Western countries, are in fact the US and European countries. The US and European countries are challenged now. And what's the challenge? The challenge is you have an inconsistency in American and European political rhetoric regarding claimed support for self-determination and the rule of law. We see that it does not exist in the Middle East and North Africa. And for some of you who are too young to remember, when President George W. Bush was in office the second time, he acknowledged that under his first term and other presidents before him, whether Democrat or Republican, there had been democratic exceptionalism when it came to dealing with the Middle East. That is, we wanted to promote democracy all over. Eastern Europe, we were going to be supportive, but in the Middle East, we were not there. He acknowledged that, and in effect was saying we're going to change that. Then we had the invasion of Iraq. It turned into an occupation, and things have gone downhill ever since. So the real question then is, can the US and the EU move to policies which get beyond the accusation that its position is actually a double standard and one that is not applied to the Middle East and North Africa, or indeed the fear that it wouldn't be applied to other countries? That would mean that one would have to be willing, working off Tariq's symbol or metaphor there, It would have to be a situation where the US and European powers would be as self-critical, not only within their own countries in terms of their policies, but with regard to when they deal with other countries. And so that they would be able to say to allies, we can work with you, but if they're authoritarian regimes that are not opening up the system, that they cannot work with them closely, that they cannot be involved in significant economic packages, trade packages. That does mean a certain kind of sacrifice. In many ways, what we are forced to do, and this is the thing that I wanted to read to you, just listen to what I'm going to say now. This is said by a major Western government leader. It was said, an unyielding belief that this Western government and Western policymakers, must have an unyielding belief that all people yearn for certain things, the ability to speak their mind, have a say in how they are governed, confidence in the rule of law, equal administration of justice, government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people, the freedom to live as they choose. And that leader said, President Obama said, those are not just American ideas, they are human rights. And that is why we will support them everywhere. And sadly, that has not happened. Sadly, at the end of the day, we are challenged, all of us, to develop in our own countries, in our own regions, whether it's in the Muslim world in the West, that kind of paradigm as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Esposito. Now we move to the second stage of our discussion here, which I will engage the speakers and Dr. Balut. Meanwhile, you can write any questions you would like to address to our speakers, and there are volunteers around. They have pieces of paper and pens. Please write your questions and they will come forward to me. In times past, Dr. Tariq, the collective will of the Muslim Ummah was sometimes represented by the ruler, sometimes by the ulama, the scholars. But in the age of the nation state, the way we see it now, and with the principles you espoused to represent and define the Ummah, how can you represent this collective will of the Ummah today? I mean, we have 1.5 billion people spread out not only through 57 Muslim majority countries, but throughout the world, including Europe, almost 20 million, the United States, and Canada, probably 6 million, and others, and throughout the world. How do we represent this collective will of the Ummah? What is the Ummah in that regard?
I think that if we have to think about I'm not sure that I can translate this into a collective will, the way we are talking about it as an ummah. What I was saying is that what we need now to do, wherever we are, is, for example, when we have Muslims in Muslim majority countries, or Muslims in the West, or Muslim in the global South, is really to reconnect to reconnect the people with the principles and to reconnect the people with the sense of belonging. How do we belong to a country and how do we behave within the country? So, for example, in Muslim majority countries, we have a problem. We have a problem in the way we are looking at ourselves in a way which sometimes is nurturing the victim mentality. We are the victims of the whole world is against us, and not understanding that what we have to do within Muslim majority countries is to carry on what was there in a way in what we witnessed during the Arab awakening and the uprisings is a sense that something can be done, that we have to change, that we have to be involved based on some of the principles. So this is exactly what should be done also in the West with people living in the country. I have a great concern about the way the Muslims are understanding the presence in the world today. which is not a leading spiritual community for principles, but just to be accepted by the West and accepted by our fellow citizens. It's not a presence to change, it's a presence to be accepted. I'm sorry, this is not Islam. Islam is a presence to change. It's to change for the better. So wherever we are, this awareness that what it means to be a Muslim should be based on a new way of speaking about our education, the new way we deal with the civil society and people. This obsession with power, it's not helping us. And this obsession with politics, not understanding that economy is essential as well. We have to be very strong on this, that the economic powers and geostrategies is essential in the way we have to deal with it. So I think that there is a shift which is needed, what I call an intellectual revolution in the way we have to look at ourselves and to look at the world.
But beyond realities of the day, on the conceptual level, when you find a nation state where some say, I am Egyptian, I am Iranian, I am Turkish, I am American, I am European or Swiss, what have you, they're dealing with their daily lives and daily questions. And at the same time, they feel that they are part of this ummah. They have to sympathize probably with the Rohingyas or the Palestinian issue and others. Is there a way where you can define this ummah? Is his loyalty is being questioned now that he is looking beyond? That's what some in Egypt were accusing, others who sympathize with causes outside, that they are disloyal, that they are not loyal, and they need to give their loyalty first to their government and to their nationalist causes rather than to the ummah causes. How do you transform this? How do you define this in today's world within the nation state? What does it mean to belong to the ummah of Islam? Where our loyalties lie here?
So this is what, if I may respond quite quickly on this, I think that is exactly what I was saying. We are loyal to our principles. So you are an Egyptian, or you are a Palestinian, or you are a Saudi, or you are an American. Of course you have to work for the best within your country, but not at the price of your principles, and not only with this obsession with your country. It's not your country first. You have to get a sense. We have a hadith which is da'if, man la yahtam bi umur al-muslimin falaysa minhum. This is a da'if, it's a weak hadith, but it's saying something which is essential, that you have to show concern and you have to be to understand that wherever you are, you should be connected with what is happening around the world. So this is what I call the critical loyalty within any country. Critical loyalty, you are loyal to your country, not when you support your country when it is wrong, but when it is right. And when you are critical towards, for example, what is happening with Palestine, what is happening with the Rohingyas, what is happening with the refugees, this is what we need, an Islamic consciousness based on our belonging to the humanity, our imperative work at the local level connected to the world, meaning that we have to speak out, we have to speak. There is no way for, anyone who thinks that it's good to be a European Muslim, while you stop talking about international issues and you only speak about the national questions or being a nationalist in the way you are dealing with the country, is just betraying everything, betraying his or her country and the principles. So how do we do this? It's really by making it clear when we are involved in a society, with whatever society, that we need to have this transnational understanding. And this is why I started my talk by having this comprehensive understanding that we need to be connected to the world, and we have to be clear on this, and not to go to something which is comparing countries. For example, I got many questions here in Turkey. Is it not Turkey better than Egypt? Yes, of course, because Egypt is not. It's not difficult to be better than Egypt today. The question is not to be better than the other, is to against your principles, is to do better than what you can do. So Turkey has to improve, and we have to help Turkey to improve, and many things should be done around the world based on these principles. And my take on this, my understanding of the Islamic Ummah is that I will be always, ever on the side of the oppressed, here and everywhere on the world. My belonging and my belonging before Allah, I'm on the side of the oppressed, Muslims or people of other faiths. And if my majority country is oppressing non-Muslims or people of other faiths, I have to stand up, because this is the way I'm dignified. This is the way the Ummah should lead and show the right example.
Dr. Bulut, speaking of Turkey, obviously Turkey has gone a long way since, let's say, 20, 30 years ago and how it is today. So in your opinion, how did Turkey was able to transform the ills of the past and try to go through a path of progress, and has it really achieved that progress, or do we still have a long way to go? And how is it showing that it is part of this Muslim Ummah, while at one point it wanted really to be looking westward, while in the past 15 years or so, it's trying to approach more the Muslim world?
So Turkey, for a long time, I can say, lost its energy to, inside of, how can we say, not real issues, but with some superficial issues. As given an example, in women issue, for a long time in Turkey till recent years, there was a big barrier for the students, for ladies, to join to the education sector with their haircrafts. So that means, for a society, in this respect, for it's really a big, a barrier for economic development in one side. In other side, this was, a kind of strict secular project for Turkey. And when you look at Turkey from an Islamic country, that you can, you can see that this is not a Muslim country, but it is like, in a different atmosphere. So for a long time, as a part of Islamic Ummah, Turkey was in the strong secularist way, but this is for socialism. For economic issues, if you like, there are a kind of, Islamic financial issues. In Turkey, these Islamic financial issues came late than comparing to other, Islamic countries. So that means, but after, 2000, until 2000 in Turkey, from time to time, as an Islamic, as a Muslim country, we lost our energy. There is a big potential as, young population, you can, combine and join all sources as a, human sources to, to improve and to develop the country and, to do like in its heritage during the Ottoman times. But you are losing your energy by, fighting to each other. So Turkey, as a first time, after one age, if you like, find itself and herself. So after 2000...
How did you find the strongest points in Turkey that was able to make that transformation? Was it a certain sovereignty, independence? Was it that you have a new leadership? Was it that you have a more visionary elite? What is it?
So I will come, and I am saying that Turkey's, big barrier was coming from intellectual level for a long time. During the last period of Ottoman times, we faced with this situation. The Ottoman elites divided to different four classes, We had nationalists, we had Westerners, we had Ottomanists, and we had Islamists. So, and this was a big problem also for the Ottoman times in recent years. And after that, it continued during the Republican era. And, you know, from time to time, we have also faced with, you know, military coup 5 times in Turkey. From, you know, the democratization process is also a long history in, you know, in Turkey. At the end, Turkey, from after 2000, during this government, succeeded in, you know, in so many issues. First, in real democracy, you know, in its Turkey, in a political stability. There were some attempts towards the government by, you know, during also this government, but the people of Turkey, as you know, they stand behind the government in this recent 15 years, and at the end, you know, in the 15th of July, it is not the people of Turkey not just stand behind the government or the state, but also behind the Ummah, I would say, because it was really a big issue and the people of Turkey. So this was very crucial, and this standing of the people of Turkey and this feeling, this supporting the government also make big contribution to the government to make, you know, some economic plans and to economic development. When you look at the Turkish, you know, economic growth and development in recent years, it's really very impressive. Now, as I told today some figures in my presentation at university, you will see that Turkey is coming behind China and India in economic growth in recent years. So that means, as you know, this succeed, Turkey can also, you know, start to think about the future of Ummah and the regional problems. Till that time, Turkey were, you know, had to look at to its inside problems, but for first time after succeeded in some, you know, economic, political, social, and after, you know, succeed in education, then Turkey started to think about the regional problems and, you know, to support some, you know, now as the, you know, the immigrants in the regional issue. Turkey is the biggest, you know, country as, you know, the share of GDP to make contribution to immigrants from the regional crisis, the Iraq, Syrian refugees, and so that means this is, you know, because of, you know, Turkey has also faced with some serial insider crisis, but
yes,
by the leadership of this political elite and with this government, and also by the new intellectuals, and also the critical, most important
education.
thing.
So what do you think, since you are a vice president, the role of education in this?
It's very critical. So until 2000, Turkey, you know, has less than 100 universities, but now Turkey has more than, you know, 185 universities in all
in 10
cities.
years.
Yeah, in all cities. And
very well. John, you talked about the West and the need to respect democracy or democratic rules, sovereignty, dignity, people's will, and all that. How do you force the West to respect that, since they are not doing it, and they have not been doing it for over a century? I mean, every single country that got its independence, it was despite what the West wanted. And even after they got, they supported authoritarian, corrupt rules. And even in the Arab Spring phenomena, that whatever support they gave, it was lukewarm. I remember when Ukraine had its own uprising, within days, I think it was 2 weeks, the IMF approved like $22 billion. But during the time of Morsi, the United States dragged on the IMF and dragged on for only $3 billion. It was never even approved. So how do you force the West to respect the will of the people?
Well, I mean, one thing that I would have to say is that, in a way, just as one could argue that there is no Muslim world, there is no West, in the way that sometimes not a monolith. I mean, the problem with the West, or the issue in the West, is the same thing in the Muslim world. You have diverse countries, diverse leadership, and differing national interests. Sometimes they're the same.
Let me revise it. Let me revise it. By the West, I mean the United States, because the West just follows its lead. So let's say, how do you force the United States in respecting the will of the people?
Yeah, let me begin by saying something, which is, but I feel the need to say it. Not just because I'm an American. I have been critical of Middle East policy under virtually every American president, okay, as far as, but on the other hand, there are aspects of being in the West and being an American that make many of us enormously feel that if somebody says, well, where else would you rather live? You know, and that always becomes to me the norm, you know, okay, can I pick another country? I remember being at a debate at LSE when Rashid Ghanouchi was talking about Islam and democracy, and some members of Hizb ut-Tahrir started shouting at him, Kufa, Kufa. I had been worried that they'd say that about me, so I was a little relieved. Rashid's a good friend, but I thought, but I remember saying to one of the kids who did it after it, I said, you know, here you are in Britain, you have a poster up that calls for the overthrow of the British government, and you're getting a degree here. And he didn't see any problem with that. And I said, well, if you really think that it's so bad, I took out my wallet and I gave him my American Express card. And I said, I'll buy you a one-way ticket to the country you came from, or any country you know, that you want to go to in that point in the Arab world, you know. And he was a little hesitant. I think in terms of affecting U.S. policy, if you look at U.S. policy, for example, after World War II, and the way in which you had a Marshall Plan, the way in which, you know, in fact, in many ways, many Americans thought, how can we be so supportive of other countries that were our enemies? There's a really very strong set of principles there, and that's the one thing that is in place. And that set of principles is not in place with other countries. So the challenge that many of us have who want to see reform, whether it was during the Vietnam War, whether it was during the Civil Rights Movement, or when it comes now, is hitting those principles. The way that you bring about change is the same way that you bring about change when you then fight discrimination towards Muslims and Islamophobia in America, which means that people have to use many different avenues to access people with power, as well as to move a population. That means using social media, etc. And so you need to both be somebody who's a critic, but somebody who can say, here are some alternative policies that can work. A concrete example is when you talk about combating violent extremism. I've done programs with the UN in the last 2 years.
But who would be doing this job? I mean, we're giving up on Western policymakers.
No.
Do you pressure them? You know, I'm not saying we're giving up because they're not going to change. It's all about power. It's all about interests. But how do you force them? I have seen it firsthand that you can change policies, but it has to be some pressure point. Does that come from Muslims in the West?
No, I think
does it come from people in the East?
There are two things that are important here. Number one is you need to deal with policymakers, whether we like it or not, in the UN, in the EU, and the US, who often are very divided on how they look at the Middle East and the Muslim world. A significant percentage think the real problem is Islam. You know, it's retrogressive. It can't adapt to modernity, and it somehow, you know, spawns these extremist groups. But another group really believes that one does have to deal with the political, social, and other grievances. And so what they need is for people to be speaking out in public, you know, with these people. But what you also...
Who should be speaking in public?
Every citizen has a way of bringing about change. The amazing thing to me when I speak in America or any place are people who don't have a sense. Whoever you are, if you believe in something strongly, you can figure out something to do. For example,
So are you putting the burden on Western people to change the
I'm
government's
putting a burden on
policies?
Western people, and I'm putting on a burden in other countries. If a country feels that it is not being treated well or understood well by Western countries, then why not get people who can be effective spokespersons
Because we're back to the
and not
same
leave it
problem.
leave it up to the very corrupt governments that you either elected or in power, but actually get out there and say something. But often what happens is that people wind up not wanting to speak out. We face the same thing in America. That is, there's a cost in any country if you speak out against the establishment.
Right.
And that cost can vary, you know what I mean? It can be if you're a young person who wants to get elected or get a job, oh my God, if I speak out, the powers that be. But everyone has an ability to bring about change. And I'll use one final concrete example, because it's the one I like, if you're going to talk about dealing with the Middle East. I've been in the field 40 years. I've done fundraisers for Muslim communities, for Palestine. And what I really like is when you go to a fundraiser and we talk about Palestine. I'm with Muslims, whether they're Palestinians or not. We talk about Palestine. We sweat about Palestine. We denounce American foreign policy. We break for dinner. Then we come back after dinner. And we've all driven there in our Lexus and our Mercedes. I don't knock those cars. I've had them myself. I'd rather have that than a Toyota. Okay, but we come back, and then what do? We wind up then doing American foreign policy, and then we go home. People don't realize that change doesn't come unless they do what they can do. What does that mean for the people that they're doing fundraisers with? They're people who are in every sector of society. They're people who have funds. And there need to be people in other countries that speak out. You just can't have a situation where when non-government leaders speak, you know, let's say if it's academics or whatever, they simply trash a Western country without saying, here's where I see the problems, but this is what I believe you need to do and we need to do in our own country. You know, and I think that is equally important. Right now, countries do what, and it's understood, it's the way nations function, whether it's Turkey, Israel, the United States, it's national interest. And unless we break that out so that people see that national interest, you know, also includes human rights, economic interests, you know what I mean? Not just national interest in terms of political and economic power, we're not going to move forward.
Dr. Tariq, I have about 6-7 questions, all almost along the same theme. People seem to still don't know how they can belong to the Ummah. What are they supposed to do? You know, people ask, what do we do for the Rohingyas? What do we do for the Palestinians? What do we do for this? What do we do for that? What do we do for the empowerment of women? There's this lack of knowledge. If you were to advise people that they have to do 3 things that will make them feel that they are part of this Ummah, that they express the will of the Ummah, that they can change. You know, again, John talked about change, and he talked in the context of Western policy changes. What would you advise people to change their conditions to feel that they are part of the Ummah? 3 things. Put you on the spot here.
There is one that I want to start with, because I was talking about the Ummah as a spiritual entity. And I would say that, you know, the way I summarize the message of Islam is 2 things: change yourself and change the world. And change yourself is something which is important. It's a danger. If you want to be part of a spiritual Ummah and you only think that it's by actions, external things that you do, that you are going to help the people, I think that it's very important in anything that we do to take seriously our personal spiritual education, which is the starting point of everything. It's the worldview, it's the spiritual dimension, it's the connection to God, it's to understand, in fact, to renew the intention of the whole process, which is the spiritual communion here. It's essential. And never to underestimate the power of supplication and dua. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, Al-ibadah huwa dua, dua huwa al-ibadah, meaning that this is the connection which is important. I will never start by only push the people to go towards, you know, actions and not getting this sense, change yourself. Now the second thing which is important that we need to get, it's to be informed, to study. That's also something which is important at the local level, at the international level, is to know how things, it's not to be simplistic about the world and to knowledge with no victim mentality, meaning we should not put ourselves as the world doesn't like Islam, the world doesn't like Muslims, and we are oppressed everywhere. No, we are oppressed as much as we are oppressing people. Muslims are oppressing their own people, and sometimes they are letting the people die. So we need to get this information and to serve the people just after you are doing this tazkiyat an-nafs with your own self is also to know how the world is working and to get knowledge, not knowledge only at the national level, not knowledge only about the Muslims, but knowledge about what is happening in the world. And then it's here that we need to have some people who decide in which field they can do the job. Don't try to do everything. You are going to do everything in a superficial level. Sometimes you have to specialize. There are specific fields, for example. And as much as you can be involved for Palestine, you can be involved for the Rohingyas, you can be involved for the refugees, and you can be involved for the migrants. And the last point, which for me it's very important as well, is that as part of the Ummah, as I said, it's the best way to be helpful towards the Palestinians or towards the Rohingyas, wherever we are, is not only to care about our people. I repeat this because for me, living in the West, I'm much more powerful by saying I'm on the side of the Palestinians because they are oppressed, as much as I am on the side of the Tibetans because they are oppressed. I'm on the side of the oppressed. Don't make it us Muslims versus the world. Let us be us Muslims with our principles. So take care of yourself, simple but essential, get some knowledge and choose a field where you can be at the same time consistent with your principles but not narrow in your understanding that you belong to humanity.
Half of the Ummah are made of women, and we live throughout the Muslim countries basically in patriarchal societies. How do you think we can bring about the Ummah, the other half of the Ummah that has been dormant for a long time, even though there are many who are trying to get out of that and try to charge a course? And we saw that during the Arab Spring, that there was many females as males in the streets. There was many of them shouting for the downfall, willing to lay down their lives, yet that has not transformed into a powerful movement that can actually revitalize this concept of the Ummah.
Yes, once again, I will start exactly the same for women, because I really think that in our tradition, the Islamic tradition, there is something which is missing, is women as women. This discourse about womanhood. And I would say that for any woman to be careful not to confuse this liberation process from patriarchy towards another type of colonization by the West. Mm-hmm. So we had a discussion this morning in our discussion between Asma and Heba, saying that, look, we all agree that we have to go towards liberation. I think that what Asma was saying, it's essential. And what we have on the other side is this, yes, but do we have to follow the dominant model? Which is not what Asma was saying, but this is what we have to put as a question.
That's right.
The only way not to go towards the dominant model is to be clear on our principles. Once again, this is what is the spiritual dimension, that a woman before God should be free, should be autonomous, and should be active. Period. That there is nothing that we can accept through the cultural side that justifying in the name of culture, patriarchy, discrimination, and no autonomy for women. At the end of the day, in the day of judgment, a woman is going to be asked exactly the same, not only about who she is, but what she has done. So this is the first step, which is personal. The second is to stop the victim mentality, once again, and to come men and women together. What the Muslim world need now is men and women coming together in the name of Islam against all type of discriminations, and to be involved in the process. So it's not only a women business, it's also a man business, and by the way, it might be a man's problem. So I think that this is where we have to come, and then there are fields where we need, in fact, as you said, look at what happened in the countries. They were on the streets, and I like this young Egyptian woman saying to the man when she was going to Hizb ut-Tahrir, if you are really man, come and join me. So saying, okay, you know what it means that, you know, the masculinity. But I think that this is why we have to be involved with this and being clear that it's multidimensional. It has to do with education, it has to do with the job market, it has to do with culture, it has to do with being very careful.
And whose role is it to make these? Is it the scholars? Is it the elites? Is it who's going to take the lead into this?
I think that this is multidimensional. It's true that today we need to have scholars being much more vocal on this, and we need to have female scholars being able to speak.
But in many societies, it's the scholars who are impeding this process. So
yes,
what do you do?
That's true, but be careful. I would say that I saw over the last years new voices coming from male and female within the Muslim world and the Muslim majority countries and the West. So there is hope here. But the civil society, average women should be involved, and there is one thing that should be known, which is part of our Islamic tradition. The scholars change their mind after the reality changes. And then you change the reality and you come and say, because 30 years ago when we were saying, we are Europeans, some scholars say, no, you have to go back home. Where was home? In Egyptian jail? Or being free in Europe today and to be able to speak. So I would say that the more we change on the ground and women and men are involved at the grassroots level, the more we are going to change.
By the way, it's the same as American judges. Whenever the streets change, they change their rulings.
That's very often.
Dr. Bulut, Turkey now is heading the Organization of Islamic Countries. What do you think Turkey needs to do to bring this, or what is it doing right now, or needs to do to bring this concept of Muslim Ummah closer to home, where we can bring together this collective of 57 countries?
So Turkey has, an important role nowadays as the chair, sitting in the chair of Islamic countries nowadays. And I hope, after some succeed in, economic development, in education, and in political stability, and as a regional power, Turkey is now a good example for other Islamic countries. It was, also was accepted by the Westerners for a long time, but they accepted it as a secularist, movement. But Turkey is really doing well in recent years in so many issues. Turkey is a big, it's also about 80 million population in the region, and nowadays, as I mentioned before, he tried to support all human crisis in the region and help the regional crisis in what she can do. She tried to do, but the most important thing I think now, economic cooperation and collaboration is very critical for the future of Islamic countries. Turkey can, do something on regenerating of Silk Road in between East and West. The center of the world economy is now moving from the West to the East. China and India is now the production center of the world economy. And in the future, for the next decades, this will increase. And the share of emerging markets is increasing in world GDP, but G7 is, declining now as a share of GDP. So that means in economic side, there are very big potential as a geographical situation. Turkey is in between East and West, and the Islamic countries, OIC countries are also, in the center of the world in this respect. In this trade in between East and West, in this corridor on energy sources, the geographical situation is also, they have very big potential, Turkey, and they can use these advantages to improve and to empower all Islamic countries together if they can, establish a good game, a good cooperation and collaboration. Turkey start with Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, free trade, and free human movement, without visa. But then this Middle East crisis appeared. It was, extended, but so we have to think also, if you would like to make some good things, that can be happen. You have to think, the second step. But I would like to stress especially the young population education. Turkey has done good things in, at university level, at high school level, at primary school level, and pre-primary school, also Turkey had so many investments. The education of young population and education of women population in Islamic world is very critical.
How many countries you have in university, right? In the university?
So now
70 countries, I think.
Pardon?
How many countries? How many students represent different countries at your university?
So at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, we have now from 76 different countries.
76.
And more than 1,200 students from different countries. So in Istanbul, there are, about more than 50 universities in Istanbul, and from different parts of the world. We have so many students, but the connections and collaboration in between Turkey and the universities in Islamic countries is also very important, and more important, not just in between among the Islamic countries, but also in between East and Western.
So basically, you're arguing for education, economic development. What about political empowerment through supporting democracy and democratic transitions within the at least neighboring countries?
So, as I stressed before, political stability is crucial issue for all these investments and for these, developments in economics, in education, in technology, in ARD, in everywhere. If you do not have political stability, you will see what will happen in Syria, in Iraq, in the other parts of the crisis exist. So political stability is important, and I would say that Turkey, in this respect, try to follow the ethical policies in the region for a long time. So, but for this reason, Turkey paid some cost.
Yes.
So, but Turkey still, of course, have to follow this
policy. But the whole point of a good government is that they have principles and ethics that will trump interests.
Right, as Tariq Ramazan stressed, principles are key for Muslims, for individuals, but it must be also principles must be key for the governments in Islamic countries. So they, as we discussed today, there are two critical questions for us during the judgment of the day. The first one is about Tawheed, to be a Muslim, to die as a Muslim. And the second one, and most critical, unacceptable, to have some rights of creation, some rights of human being. So, in that means all the governments, and in addition to people, all the governments and the rulers, politicians have to be careful about that.
John, coming back to some of the themes that you presented, and obviously you are the director of a very important initiative called the Bridge Initiative that is trying to confront Islamophobia in the United States, across the world, especially in Western world, in Europe. And you've talked also about, that we can't disengage. We need to engage with Western policymakers, show them the way and all that. But what about the people in this area? what do you think, what would you recommend to them that will help you in your work as you are confronting Islamophobes, as you are trying to advise policymakers? What do you think the people in the audience and beyond, even those who are on TV and others, what should they do? How should they understand what's going on there and be contributors so that they can make things better?
Well, I think that I just want to preface myself and say that something Tariq has talked about several times is the most important thing. From my point of view, and I hope nobody will be offended, but whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, the fact that you perform rituals is nice. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have an impact in terms of principles and values.
Right.
And therefore, emphasis on principles and values, what some people talk Maqasid Sharif, for example, today, that are rooted where you say, this comes from our religious tradition. And having that taught in the schools, as well as when you train imams, that transforms a population that has a consciousness that then, when it votes or whatever, will challenge. If not, what do we have today in the Muslim world?
That's right.
In Iran and in Saudi Arabia, everybody goes to the mosque around the same time, prays to the same God, and then their leaders talk about going at each other politically.
Mm-hmm. I just want to support your point here, is that because out of something that I experienced, when some Muslims were taken out by the government in the United States, those who used to go to the mosque 5 times a day, every single prayers, they never showed any support to those who are in prison. You know what Tariq was talking about. You need to stand up for justice and denounce injustice. It was those who had this conscience in there, and they were not even Muslims.
Yeah.
Some of them denounced even as homosexuals and others. They were at the forefront of this fight, fighting for justice in the United States and taking the government on, and actually it had an impact on the jury where they did the right thing. So
well, look at what the Muslim ban. How many people went to the airports in a matter of hours?
Right.
And they weren't just Muslims. Overwhelming number of people went. You had lawyers who weren't Muslim right there on site offering help.
Their help, yes.
Because what's happened in America is that they realize in a crisis we have to work across all of the problems, the issues that divide us.
So how can we bring about this cooperation among the people? I remember the during the Arab Spring movement, there was another movement in America, where the people at the squares, and they would call the I forgot what the name was, but they were taking on the cities. But obviously it didn't live much because there were powerful forces against it. How we can bring about this unity among the people who are facing injustice? I
think that the way in which we adjust it, just to be clear on what we have here, we have a project called The Bridge. And we don't just say ending Islamophobia. The first point we make is we refer to an American and a universal principle, which is pluralism, protecting pluralism. And that's why Islamophobia is wrong, or racism towards blacks are wrong. So you know what I mean? So that somebody can't say, oh, this is just somehow some people that have their own bias with regard to Islam. But the real challenge is that when you look at America and Europe today, you see a situation in which, in recent years, an exponential increase in anti-Islam and anti-Muslim bias, discrimination, hate crimes, and violence, okay? And a good deal of it caused by a fact that media does what media does, whether it's in Turkey or it's any place else. It operates on a principle that basically says, if it leads, it bleeds. I mean, when people come and interview me, they don't say, tell me about American values and kind of like, do you love your wife? No, they want to talk about contest, okay? So what we do is we develop a site, which is bridge.georgetown.edu, where first of all, we put in there the information that people can easily access when others in the society say, how come Muslims haven't spoken out against violence and terrorism?
Yeah.
When in fact there are thousands of, but it's not there. And people will say, but I don't see it in the newspapers or on TV. We do fact sheets on members of government. You want to have change, you do a fact sheet. You don't just write against somebody, you do a fact sheet. So we look and we say, okay, if we have a new administration, such as this one, who are the key advisors and how do they view Islam and Muslims? And you see that some of the talented people in the cabinet and in the government, however talented and different they are, have said things like Islam is not a religion, it's a dangerous political ideology, and then think what the result is in terms of civil liberties of Muslims in Europe and America, for example, but also in terms of foreign policy. Then we put information on Islam and Muslims, but it's not just, here's some information about Muslims pray 5 times a day. All of that's there. We have videos, we have interviews with Muslims. Who are they and what do they do? What kind of people are they?
So a lot of education there.
Are they doctors? Are they educators? Are they people who are involved in their communities? Not just the Muslim community, you see? People who have a vision that the Ummah is not simply the Muslim Ummah. You know, I mean, just as I don't think the Prophet would have defined it that way. So I think that that's what needs to be done. In terms of people in this region, well, I mean, the fact is, people should be engaging in this kind of activity. They should be concerned about not the image out there, but also at home. In other words, do you have a population of young people who really have a set of principles and values that make them concerned about discrimination in Muslim countries as well as discrimination against, let's say, Muslims in the United States and Europe, and who will in many ways want to get involved?
The elephant in the room is always Palestine. And I can see, and I'm sure you can see, there is a strong connection and link between those who espouse Islamophobic ideas and concepts and practices and policies, and those who are pro-Israel. How do you confront that? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that what you do is you try to build up a significant machine that makes difference. Part of the reason we have Islamophobia is that in America, in the last decade, more than $200 million, probably closer to $220 million, have been given by philanthropists, by people with wealth, to these anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim organizations, who then have their own websites that give this information out, you know, the negative information, who create centers, and that's where most people get their news, you know? I mean, they go to social media. So what you need to do then is to build a similar kind of machine, and the fact is that does not exist among Muslims.
Right, and these people are linked to pro-Israeli forces.
Yeah, and if from my point of view, if Muslims want change, I say this to Muslims in America and Europe, okay? The way you get change is first, you do it, and once you do it, everybody else comes in, rather than sitting back and say, oh, the other people should be doing it. You know? That happens when you feel like, if you overplay the victimhood, you wind up getting out of things, not only convincing yourself, but one of the excuses is, oh, what can I do? You know, I'm powerless. No, you can, for example, I mean, just as a concrete example, this is a really small example, but we did a book on, with a Turkish colleague, we did a book on Islamophobia and the challenge of pluralism. And it was published, it was translated into Turkish, but more recently, an organization here, I think it's a business, is publishing it in English, Turkish, I think French, and German. Okay? I mean, there are those ways to make a difference and support other, you know, to support these kinds of ventures. But the most important thing for the future, whether it's here or in the West, is until we, through our media and through our educational system, okay,
yes,
really make people aware of the fact that the challenge in the 21st century is political and religious pluralism, okay? There will be no democratization in the region. There will be no strong democracies in the West operating on their principles rather than simply, you know, political pressure. And there will not be the kind of growing animosity that exists among pockets of Muslim extremists and pockets of other extremists in the world. I mean, it's a broad-based challenge. But, you know, I look at an audience here, and my challenge to the audience will be, if you think that you learned something and it was good, well, what are you going to do? And I'll bet you, if I didn't say this and I did a survey, a lot of people would say, this is a great thing. And then I'd say, and so how did it change what you do in the next month? Have you thought about what you can do with regard to this, to be an agent of change? For a lot of us, that's not what we do. We feel good that we're better than other people who came here tonight.
Yes.
We don't become agents of change. And when I studied Islam, the thing that attracted me the most, and autobiographically, when it was suggested I study Islam, I fought against it. But what struck me really strongly was when Ismail, or when I looked at the tradition, it talked about the fact that intention is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you do.
Right.
It's not simply saying that I intend the good, it's whether or not you do the good, and whether or not, as you referred to also, whether or not you're willing to pay the cost, whether it's in this life or the next. It reminds me of, and I'm just going to end with this. I'm not going to get very specific. An individual in a very, very wealthy Gulf state had a chance to support a major project, and he and others were really concerned with it, okay? And they said, it's going to be done, okay? That never happened, but that individual felt free to call a friend and say, having made the promise, I'm building a mosque in the United States, and it's going to get a lot of attention. Do you think John Esposito would come and speak at it? I mean, he missed the whole point.
Yes.
And why? Because building a mosque, he felt, was a guarantee. He found a text that could make him feel ritually that if I just do this, it's okay. It's a little bit like some of the early Christians knew or believed that when you converted, all your sins were forgiven, right? And so a very famous one, St. Augustine, held off for a while. Like, I'm not ready yet. I want to get the bang for the buck when I convert.
Right, thank you. Last question to Dr. Tariq, and I'm putting you on the spot because you need to answer it in 2 minutes. Dr. Al-Farouqi, when he talked about ummatism, and he was trying to transform this concept into reality, he said 3 things have to be realized: consensus of vision, consensus of will, and consensus of action. How would you define these 3 things? What would be the vision? Which will is it? And what action is required?
I understand in which way he was referring to this. I think that in our world today, this kind of a perception that there is one vision, and that we can have one vision which is a global one. I really think that I will deconstruct this by saying the overall vision is the way we look at humanity today, and in which way we have to come back to very strong principles. And in this globalized world, when we are dealing with emotional politics, is to come with rationality and wisdom. What should be the driving force is rationality and wisdom, and rationality has to be also with being realistic. And what we said, I think that you reminded me of something which is important, is I wouldn't go for an understanding of this global ummah only Muslims. You know what happened in Medina. Hum min ummatina. This is what the Prophet said about the Jews. And when we are in a structured society, we need to understand that pluralism is something which is essential. So to deal with an overall vision which is based on let us now try to work wherever we are for more dignity, more justice, more equality, and not to disconnect politics and economy, because this is essential. We are completely lost in the economic field. We are just dealing with power, but we don't get it, that we need to be very strong in economics and in the way we have to deal with this. So this could be an overall vision. Now, the way this has to be translated at the grassroots level, this is something that we need to accept, that there will be a diversity of views, that it is going to be local, it's going to be at the level of the people, and we need to prioritize our work, what comes first. And we all are repeating that education is essential in our society, no victim mentality, no victimhood, do the work for yourself at the local level. And this is also something which is from all the peripheries to be quite clear on the centrality of what we have to to do. And I would like much more. I think that, we are talking a lot about Islam. Might be that in the future we have to be much more Muslims than to talk about Islam.
And action?
As to the action, that this is once again, I think that, for example, today, what we were talking about education, to be more rational than emotional, to be very cautious. We are talking about Trump, and we are saying this is populism and the way it's emotional politics. Muslims should be very, very aware that they could be driven by exactly the same emotional politics, in which it's us versus them, and let's go. And I think that this is very dangerous. And we have literally some of our Salafi brothers and sisters, in the way sometimes they portray their belonging to the community, is very much based on religious populism, that we have to be very... Our way of dealing with this is spirituality, rationality, and then education, social justice, and to be quite clear that now we also have, this morning we were talking about decolonizing minds, and we have to decolonize minds, that's true. The intellectual liberation, it's important, but it's also the real understanding that now the contribution should come also from the global south, from our, for example, what is our relationship as Muslims with Latin America? Why is it that we are obsessed with the States? Why is it that it's the States and Europe?
Because they are ruling the world.
That's the point.
But they are not the primary people who are responsible for what's going on in this part of the world. The primary people who are responsible
if you are
for
independent and sovereign, yes. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this illuminating discussion. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, for the past 3 days, we've been having this powerful discussions on many aspects of the Muslim Ummah, and we promise you at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and Istanbul Sabah Din Zaim University that this discussion will not end here, that this will continue our research and continue our discussions in future publications and conferences. Please give them a round of applause for all of us. I also would like to call Dr. Mehmet Bulut to present these awards to our two wonderful speakers. It says, this is a plaque that says the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabah Din Zaim University is pleased to present the Distinguished Public Intellectual Award to Professor Dr. Tariq Ramadan for his outstanding contributions to Islamic thought and reform, Islam in the West, and to the study of Islamic ethics. Istanbul, Turkey, October 10, 2017.
Thank you so much for your contributions.
And خليك واقف. Dr. Tariq, خليك هنا. Yes, please. This one also says the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabah Din Zaim University is pleased to present the Distinguished Public Intellectual Award to Professor Dr. John L. Esposito for his outstanding contributions to the study of Islam, to Muslim-Christian understanding, and for his resolute efforts to end Islamophobia. Istanbul, Turkey, October 10, 2017.
Thank you so much for your contributions.
The third one, again, the Distinguished Public Intellectual Award was presented, and he knows about it, and he has accepted it, and I'm going to accept it on his behalf, to Dr. Ibrahim Kalin for his outstanding contributions to Islamic philosophy and epistemology, Islam and the West, and for his public service.
Instead of him.
Instead of him, I will give it to him, inshallah. And we can get all of three of us. Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you in the future, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.